By the way, if you're the richest man in the world, does that make you the happiest man in the world? History has proven that not to be the case. And so, the only way that you could get into one of those families today would be to be adopted into that family. That's about the only way. Adopted into the family. And our text today talks about being adopted into the Christian family. And that's what we're going to look at. Adopted into the right family, the Christian family. Now, when you think of family, and you think of inheritance, who comes up as a very important figure in an inheritance? Well, it's the father, okay? The father comes up as a very important figure in inheritance. But as we go to the Bible, and especially as we look at the words of Jesus in John 8, before we get into our text, we need this reference. In John 8, verses 44 and 47, Jesus actually says that not everyone is a member of God's family. Not everyone. Now, the semi-secular world will teach you today and will say that we are all God's what? Children. That is not necessarily what Paul or Jesus said. Indeed, God created all, but according to Paul's teaching and from Jesus' own words, no, we're not all. Not everybody is God's children. Jesus talks about two fathers. And there in our text, he says to a group of people who those people were absolutely convinced because of their father Abraham, they had it made, that their father was who? That God was their father Abraham, the lineage, they could prove the lineage, they knew they had the inheritance, they had taught that for many, many years. Jesus arrives on the scene, and what does he tell them? What does he say to them? He says to them, you are of your father, the what? The devil. And you want to do the desires of your father. And you go down to verse 47, he who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason you do not hear them, because you are not what? Of God. So what is Jesus suggesting there? Who's your father? Who is your father? There's that modern day expression, who's your daddy? Who's your father? And this is something that Paul has already alluded to. Paul has already mentioned in our study the two fathers. What did he call them? The first Adam and the what? Second Adam. And when he introduced those, he also said and asked the question in a roundabout way, who's your father? The first Adam or what? Second Adam. Now Paul says we're all born into this world with the first father. And if that's going to change, putting this all together with what Paul has just said, there has to be an adoption that takes place in order to be a member of the family of God. And now he talks in verses 14 and 17 about adoption. The adopted Christian. Now, let me give you a background to this. When Paul brings this idea up about adoption, the Jewish mindset didn't know what he was talking about. The Jews had no legal or plan of adoption. The way they solved if a child was without a father they used what was called the Levirate marriage. But the Romans knew about adoption. The Romans had adoption. And by the way, who's this book to? It's the Romans. Romans had a very specific and a very strict way and a very procedural way for someone to be adopted, and you could be adopted at any age. In Roman adoption, the Roman adoption was absolute. Once you were adopted into a family, it was absolute. And that meant if you were adopted into a family, you had the same rights, you had the same inheritance, you were considered legally as a child or a son or a daughter that actually was born into that family. That was absolute. In history, we have an incident that proves how strong Roman adoption was. And it's the story of Emperor Claudius. When Emperor Claudius was getting old, he wanted to pass his throne, his emperorship, onto somebody that wasn't a member of his family. If you know your history, you know who it was. It was Nero. And Nero was not related at all, but Claudius wanted Nero to be the next emperor. And so what did he do? He adopted him.